I came home from the hospital thinner, weaker, and still tasting disinfectant in the back of my throat, believing at least one thing in my life was still mine. The Montana sky was wide and painfully blue, the same color it had been when I was a kid running fence lines with my mother, and for a moment I let myself believe the hardest part was over. I had survived the illness. I had buried my mother. All I needed now was rest. That illusion shattered when my key wouldn't turn. I tried again, slower, pressing the metal into the lock like patience might make it listen. Nothing. My hand trembled not from fear, but from the weakness that still lived in my bones. That's when I noticed the small black keypad mounted beside the door blinking softly like it had always belonged there. It hadn't. Through the front window I saw curtains I didn't recognize and a heavy chair that wasn't mine. The door opened before I knocked. My father stood there, one hand on the frame blocking the entrance. He didn't look surprised to see me. He looked prepared. Behind him, my stepmother hovered with her arms crossed, and my half-sister lingered just out of view, half hidden by the hallway wall. My father didn't ask how I was. He didn't say welcome home. He said calmly, like he'd rehearsed it, "Emily, you shouldn't be here anymore." In that moment, I understood this wasn't confusion. It was a decision. I stood on the porch a second longer than I should have, the wind pushing gently at my hospital-issued sweater, the kind they give you when you're discharged and still look like you might fall apart. The ranch smelled the same as always, dry grass and dust and pine, and that familiarity made the words hit harder. This was the place I grew up, the place my mother had sworn would always be mine to come back to. My father stepped outside and closed the door behind him. The sound was soft but final. "We talked about this," he said, keeping his voice low, as if the land itself might overhear. "This is a family matter. You've been gone a long time. I told him I'd just come from the hospital. I said it quietly, not to guilt him, just to state a fact." My stepmother laughed under her breath, the kind of laugh that pretends not to be cruel. "That's exactly why this isn't the right place for you," she said. "You need stability. We've made arrangements." Arrangements. The word felt heavy and slippery. I asked what she meant, and my father answered instead. He talked about temporary management, about responsibility, about how after my mother passed things needed to be simplified. He spoke like a man reading from a legal pamphlet, careful and distant, using words that sounded reasonable if you didn't know what they were hiding. My half-sister finally stepped into view. She looked smaller than I remembered, her eyes darting between us. She didn't say anything. She just clutched the sleeve of my stepmother's jacket and stared at the floor. I asked if I could at least come inside and sit down. My legs were shaking now, the fatigue catching up with me. My father hesitated just long enough to make it hurt, then shook his head. "It's better if you make other arrangements," he said. "For now." For now. Another phrase designed to soften a door slammed shut. I looked past him, past the new curtains and the unfamiliar furniture, to the hallway where my mother's old boots used to sit. They were gone. In their place stood a neat row of shoes that didn't belong to her or to me. That was when I realized how thoroughly I had already been erased. I didn't argue. I didn't raise my voice. I nodded like a guest who had misunderstood an invitation and stepped back off the porch. The gravel shifted under my feet, loud in the quiet. My stepmother relaxed as if she'd been waiting for me to explode so she could point to it later. As I walked toward my car, my father called my name. I turned, hoping against reason. "This is what's best for everyone," he said. "Don't make this harder than it needs to be." I wanted to ask him when he'd decided I wasn't part of everyone anymore. I wanted to tell him I could barely stand, that my body still felt borrowed. But the memory of my mother's voice stopped me. "Be patient. Be quiet. Let them show their hand." So I left. I drove until the ranch disappeared behind a curve in the road, until my hands stopped shaking on the steering wheel. I didn't cry right away. Shock has a way of numbing even the deepest wounds. I checked into a small roadside motel just outside town, the kind with thin walls and a flickering sign, and sat on the edge of the bed with my shoes still on. My phone buzzed once, a message from my father. It said, "Please don't come back unannounced. We're trying to move forward." I set the phone face down. Lying there listening to the hum of the heater and the distant sound of trucks on the highway, I replayed the scene on the porch. The careful words, the changed lock, the way none of them asked what my mother had wanted. That was when it clicked. My father hadn't looked guilty. He'd looked confident, and confidence like that doesn't come from hope. It comes from believing you've already won. I stared at the ceiling, my mother's face rising uninvited in my mind, and for the first time since leaving the ranch, I let myself breathe. If they thought locking me out had ended the story, they didn't know my mother very well. And they didn't know me at all. I woke up to the sound of a truck engine coughing to life outside my motel room, my body heavy and unfamiliar like it belonged to someone older than 32. For a few seconds, I didn't know where I was. Then the memory of the porch, the lock, my father's voice slid back into place, and my chest tightened. The room smelled faintly of stale coffee and cleaner. The curtains didn't quite close, letting in a thin blade of morning light that landed across my suitcase. I checked my phone out of habit, knowing there would be nothing there. No missed calls, no messages asking if I'd slept okay, nothing from the man who had watched me walk away the night before. I sat up slowly, every joint protesting, and let my feet touch the cold floor. The doctor had told me recovery would be uneven, good hours followed by bad ones. I hadn't expected the bad ones to come with being homeless. I made myself sit still. Reacting was what my stepmother expected. Tears, anger, accusations she could later describe as proof that I was unstable, that she and my father had done the responsible thing. I could already hear her voice, sweet and regretful, telling someone how worried they were about me. That was when my mother's words came back to me. Not loud, not dramatic, just steady. Don't rush. Let the truth breathe. The memory pulled me backward gently at first, then all at once. The hospital room where my mother spent her last weeks was nothing like the one I'd just left. Hers was smaller, quieter. The light always dimmed because it hurt her eyes. The machines made soft patient noises like they were waiting for her to catch up. I sat beside her most days, reading out loud when she was too tired to talk, holding her hand when she slept. One afternoon, when the nurses had stepped out and the hallway was quiet, she asked me to close the door. She looked at me for a long moment before speaking, her gaze sharper than it had been in weeks. "Your father thinks I don't notice things anymore," she said. "But I do." I told her she should rest. She smiled the way she always did when she was about to say something she'd already decided. "I need you to listen," she said, "not argue. Just listen." She told me she was afraid of what would happen after she was gone. Not afraid of dying, but of what would be rewritten once she wasn't there to correct it. She said she'd watched my stepmother grow bolder over the years, watched my father choose peace in his house over honesty with his child. "He's not cruel," she said. "He's weak. And weak people can do terrible things when they're scared." I didn't want to hear it. I wanted to believe the ranch would anchor us all the way it always had, that no matter what happened between adults, that land would still be home. My mother squeezed my hand. "That's why I planned," she said. She didn't show me papers. She didn't list details. She talked in outlines the way she always had when she wanted me to understand the shape of something without getting lost in the edges. She told me she had spoken to someone she trusted. She told me things were arranged so that no one could quietly take what wasn't theirs. Most of all, she made me promise something that felt wrong at the time. "When this starts," she said, her voice barely above a whisper, "you stay quiet. You don't confront. You don't explain. You don't defend yourself. Let them think whatever they want." I asked her why. I told her silence had never protected me before. "This time it will," she said. "Because the truth won't need you to shout. It will arrive on its own." I remember nodding, even though every part of me resisted the idea. I wanted to fight for her. For us. For the life we'd built. But she looked relieved when I agreed, and I knew the promise mattered. When she died a few days later, the room felt impossibly empty. At the funeral, my father stood stiff beside my stepmother, accepting condolences like obligations. He hugged me briefly, his hand light on my back, already turning away. I told myself it was grief. I told myself not to read too much into it. Back in the motel room, the memory loosened its grip, leaving me staring at the stained ceiling, my mother's voice echoing in my head. Stay quiet. Let them show their hand. I reached for my bag and pulled out the small notebook I'd taken from her bedside drawer after the funeral. I hadn't opened it yet. Part of me was afraid it would be too much, that seeing her handwriting would undo whatever composure I had left. The first page wasn't sentimental. It was practical. Dates, names, short notes written in the neat, deliberate script she'd used her whole life. It wasn't a diary. It was a record. I flipped through slowly. References to the ranch, to accounts, to documents stored in places I recognized. And tucked into the back pocket, a folded business card worn soft at the edges. I held it between my fingers, feeling the strange steadiness that came with recognition. This was what she meant. Not comfort. Preparation. My phone buzzed again. Another message from my father. He said they hoped I understood this was temporary, that emotions were high, that they were doing their best to manage things responsibly. I didn't reply. Instead, I lay back on the bed, the notebook resting on my chest, and let myself feel the anger I'd been holding at bay. Not the kind that makes you reckless, but the kind that sharpens your focus. If my father believed confidence would carry him through this, he had misjudged the woman who raised me. And if my stepmother thought silence meant surrender, she was about to learn the difference. I closed my eyes and listened to the world outside the thin motel walls, already knowing I wouldn't be going back to the ranch unprepared. I woke up to the buzz of my phone on the nightstand, the screen lighting the room before my eyes had fully opened. For a moment, I hoped it was a missed call, a sign that someone had thought better of what they'd said the day before. It wasn't. It was a notification. A post. Tagged photos. I sat up slowly, my body stiff, and opened the app I hadn't checked since the funeral. The first image filled the screen before I could brace myself. My stepmother stood in front of the ranch house, smiling too wide, one arm looped through my father's. The caption read like a celebration. Fresh start. New chapter. Family. Family. I swiped. Another photo. The living room rearranged. My mother's old armchair gone, replaced with something sleek and unfamiliar. A throw pillow embroidered with words about blessings and beginnings. In the corner of the frame, the edge of a photograph I didn't recognize already hanging where our family pictures used to be. The comments rolled in beneath it. Congratulations. So happy for you. About time you had the place to yourselves. No one asked where I was. I put the phone down and stared at the wall, my heartbeat slow and deliberate. This wasn't impulsive. It wasn't grief. It was presentation. They were telling a story, and in it, I had never existed. When I picked the phone back up, there was a message waiting from my father. It wasn't long. He said they were settling in. He said he hoped I was taking care of myself. He said it would be best if I didn't complicate things right now. The words were careful, neutral, the kind you use when you expect them to be read aloud later. I could hear my stepmother's voice in the phrasing, smoothing the edges, framing concern as reason. I didn't respond. Instead, I scrolled again, this time with intention. I noticed what they showed and what they didn't. The angles avoided certain parts of the house. The captions spoke about memories being made, not ones being honored. The ranch was no longer history. It was branding. A knot tightened in my chest, not from jealousy, but from clarity. This was how she had always operated. When I was younger, any disagreement became a story about my attitude. Any boundary turned into evidence of my distance. If I spoke up now, it would slide neatly into the same pattern. Emily is unstable. Emily is grieving. Emily doesn't know what she's doing. I thought of the way my father had stood in the doorway, blocking the house with his body. The confidence in his voice. It hadn't been cruel. It had been resolved. Another notification popped up. A comment under the first post. Someone asked casually who actually owned the land now. It was the kind of question locals asked when they'd seen families fall apart before. I watched as the comment disappeared. Deleted. Not answered. Erased. That told me more than any argument could have. I set the phone aside and forced myself to stand to shower to eat a piece of toast even though it tasted like nothing. My body was still healing and I couldn't afford to let anger pull me back into weakness. The doctor's voice echoed in my head. Pace yourself. Don't rush recovery. I sat by the window afterward, wrapped in the thin motel blanket, and watched the morning traffic pass. Every so often, someone from town walked by someone who probably already believed the version of events being shared online. I imagined my stepmother explaining it all over coffee, her voice full of regret. Emily lives far away. She hasn't been well. We're just taking care of things. Taking care of things. The phrase repeated in my head until it lost its meaning. Around midday, my phone buzzed again. This time, it was a text from a neighbor I recognized, someone who'd lived near the ranch for as long as I could remember. She asked if I was back in town. I hesitated before replying, then kept it simple. I said yes. I said I was recovering. She sent a short message back. I thought so. There's been a lot of activity out there. I didn't ask what she meant. I didn't need to. The images online had already told me. Movement. Changes. Momentum. By late afternoon, another post appeared. My stepmother had taken a picture of the pasture, the sun low and golden, the caption talking about plans and potential, about turning dreams into reality. She tagged a local contractor in the comments. That was new. I stared at the screen longer than I meant to. Contractors meant permanence. It meant they weren't just occupying space. They were altering it, claiming it. My phone vibrated again. This time it was my father calling. I watched it ring, my thumb hovering over the screen. I imagined answering, imagined the careful disappointment in his voice, the gentle insistence that this was all for the best. I imagined how easily he would sound reasonable. I let it go to voicemail. The message he left was brief. He said he hoped I wasn't taking things personally. He said emotions were still raw. He said the ranch needed direction and someone had to provide it. I sat there long after the call ended, the quiet pressing in around me. This was the part my mother had warned me about. The calm before confrontation. The moment when silence felt like surrender. But it wasn't. That evening I opened my mother's notebook again, this time, reading more carefully. I traced the lines with my finger, connecting dates to places, names to actions. The structure emerged slowly, like a map revealing itself once you knew how to look. My father's story was neat, public, confident. The truth I was beginning to understand didn't need to be loud. It needed time. As the sky darkened outside the motel window, I made a decision. I would not correct their narrative. Not yet. I would let them keep posting, keep planning, keep stepping forward as if nothing stood in their way. Because every step they took without looking back made it easier to see where they were headed. And once they crossed the wrong line, there would be no deleting it. I didn't answer my father's messages. I turned my phone face down on the nightstand and let the screen go dark, like closing a door without slamming it. Every part of me wanted to respond, to correct the record, to say I wasn't unstable or confused or dramatic. But I had learned the hard way that explaining myself to people who had already decided who I was only gave them more material to use against me. Silence felt unnatural at first. It sat in my chest like unfinished business. I paced the motel room, folded and unfolded the same sweater, checked the lock twice, even though I knew no one was coming. My stepmother thrived on reaction. She fed on it. If I exploded now, she would tuck it neatly into her story and carry it around like proof. So I stayed quiet. Late that morning, I drove without a destination, letting the road pull me along. Montana has a way of making you feel small in the best possible sense. Long stretches of highway cut through open fields, the land rolling out in every direction, steady and indifferent to human drama. I cracked the window and let the cold air wake me up, grounding me in my body again. As I drove, memories surfaced uninvited. Other moments when I had spoken up and been told I was too sensitive, too emotional, too much. Each time the result had been the same. I was labeled the problem, and the real issue slipped quietly out of view. I pulled into a small town I recognized, one I hadn't visited in years. The hardware store sat on the corner like it always had, its sign faded but familiar. My mother used to bring me there on Saturdays, teaching me how to choose the right nails, the right tools, the right materials. She believed in doing things properly, even if it took longer. I went inside, the bell over the door chiming softly, the smell of wood and metal wrapped around me unexpectedly comforting. The man behind the counter looked up and smiled, then paused, recognition dawning. "Emily," he said like he was testing the name. "Haven't seen you in a long time." I nodded. My voice caught when I answered, so I kept it brief. We talked about the weather, about how quiet the winter had been, about nothing important at all. Then he said casually, "Your folks have been busy out at the ranch." I felt my shoulders tighten. I asked what he meant, keeping my tone neutral. "Supplies," he said. "Your dad came in last week asking about fencing materials. Sounded like they were planning some changes." There it was. Confirmation that the story had already spread, accepted without question. Your dad. Not the family. Not us. Ownership assumed, settled, spoken aloud. I thanked him and bought a few small things I didn't need just to give my hands something to do. As I left, I realized how quickly narratives take root when no one challenges them. People fill in the gaps with whatever seems simplest. Back in the car, I sat for a moment before starting the engine. If I confronted my father now, if I showed up demanding explanations, it would only validate the version of events they were pushing. Emotional daughter returns to cause trouble. Sick woman disrupts stability. No. If I was going to do this, it had to be different. I drove back to the motel and finally opened my mother's notebook properly. Not flipping through it this time, but reading it like a set of instructions. There were no speeches in her handwriting, no emotional pleas. Just facts, names of accounts, notes about land parcels, reminders to check dates and signatures. She hadn't written it for comfort. She had written it for clarity. I found the page I'd skipped before, the one with a short list of names and phone numbers. One was circled lightly, almost apologetically. A lawyer she had trusted, someone local, someone who understood land and family disputes, someone she had prepared long before she ever got sick. I sat on the edge of the bed and stared at that name, feeling the weight of the choice in front of me. Calling him would change everything. It would mean stepping onto a path that didn't allow for pretending this was just a misunderstanding. My phone buzzed again. Another message from my father. He said he hoped I was settling in somewhere comfortable. He said they were only trying to protect the family. He said he didn't want things to get ugly. I almost laughed. Things were already ugly. They were just quiet about it. I didn't respond. That night, I barely slept. My body ached, my thoughts looping between the porch and my mother's voice. I kept seeing the look on my father's face, the certainty. He believed he was doing the right thing, or at least he believed he could justify it. By morning, the decision had settled in me like a stone. Silence wasn't about hiding. It was about timing, about letting people reveal themselves fully before you spoke. I got dressed slowly, choosing clothes that didn't draw attention, and stepped outside. The air was sharp and clean, the kind that makes you feel awake whether you want to or not. I stood there for a long moment, breathing it in, feeling steadier than I had in days. Back in the room, I picked up the phone and typed a single message. Not to my father, not to my stepmother. To the number in my mother's notebook. My name is Emily Carter. My mother was Margaret Carter. She told me to call you if I ever needed help protecting the ranch. I set the phone down before doubt could creep in. Whatever happened next, I knew one thing for certain. Staying quiet had already shown me more truth than any argument ever had. I sat in my car with the engine off the motel parking lot, quiet around me, and opened my mother's notebook all the way for the first time. The cover creaked softly like it had been waiting. I expected sentiment. What I found was order. The first pages were dates and short lines written in my mother's careful hand, not memories, instructions. Names of accounts with arrows pointing to initials I recognized. Notes about parcels of land marked by fences and creek lines the way she had always described the ranch to me when I was younger. There were reminders to review deeds, to verify signatures, to never rely on verbal promises. It was the handwriting of a woman who loved deeply and trusted carefully. Tucked into the back was the business card edges worn smooth. I turned it over between my fingers, feeling steadier than I had in days. The name meant nothing to me, but the address did. A small office not far from town. Local. Quiet. The kind of place my mother would have chosen. I called. The man who answered did not rush me. When I said my name, there was a pause, then a gentle recognition. He asked me how I was holding up. Not what I needed. Not what I wanted to do. How I was. That alone told me I was in the right place. We met that afternoon. His office smelled faintly of old paper and coffee, the shelves lined with binders instead of awards. He remembered my mother clearly. Not as a client, but as a person. He spoke about her the way people do when they respected someone, not just professionally. I told him everything. The illness, the porch, the new lock, the posts online. I expected interruptions. I didn't get any. He listened occasionally, jotting down a note, his expression steady. When I finished, he leaned back in his chair and folded his hands. "Your mother planned carefully," he said. She knew conflict was likely. He explained the structure, slowly making sure I understood each part. The ranch, as it turned out, had never been a single simple thing. Over the years, ownership had been layered. Portions tied to my father's name, portions tied to my mother's, accounts linked to specific parcels, rights of use that didn't always align with public assumptions. What your father has, he said, is partial authority. What he does not have is the right to transfer or alter certain parts of the property. I felt something loosen in my chest. Not relief. Focus. He explained why the will hadn't been announced immediately. My mother had requested a delay, anticipating pressure and interference. She wanted time for actions to speak before documents did. It was legal, deliberate, risky, but sound. "There is a chance your father contests this," he said. "That's not unusual, but the groundwork is solid." I asked him what mattered most now. Evidence, he said without hesitation, and timing. He told me what to watch for. Physical changes, financial activity, any indication that decisions were being made beyond the scope of authority. He warned me not to confront anyone directly. Not yet. When I left his office, the sky had clouded over the air, heavy with the promise of rain. I sat in my car for a moment, letting the information settle. My father's confidence on the porch made sense now. He believed he was operating within his rights, or at least close enough to blur the line. Over the next few days, I watched quietly. I checked social media once in the morning and once at night. I listened when neighbors mentioned trucks coming and going. I kept notes the way my mother had, dates and details, nothing emotional. On the fourth day, a post appeared that made my stomach drop. A photograph of fence posts stacked near the east pasture. A caption about improving the land for the future. Tagged accounts of a local contractor and a supply company. The east pasture. I checked my notes. That land fell under my mother's portion. Altering it wasn't a gray area. It was a line. I called the lawyer. He didn't sound surprised. "They're moving faster," he said. "That happens when people think time is on their side." He asked me to document everything. Screenshots, dates, names. He asked if I had heard anything locally about permits. I hadn't. That evening, a neighbor I trusted stopped by the motel. She spoke in low tones, glancing around as if the wind might carry her words. She said workers had been out early that morning. No permits posted, no notices filed, just activity. When she left, I sat on the bed and stared at the wall. My body was tired in a way that sleep didn't fix. Part of me wanted to drive back to the ranch and stop it myself, to stand in front of the fence posts and demand they leave. But my mother's notebook lay open beside me, her handwriting steady and precise. She had known this moment would come, the temptation to act too soon, to trade strategy for satisfaction. The next day, the lawyer confirmed it. No permits had been filed, no approvals requested. The changes being made were unauthorized. They've crossed from assumption into violation, he said. That matters. I felt a strange mix of sadness and clarity. This wasn't just about me anymore. It wasn't about being excluded or erased. It was about boundaries being ignored because they thought no one was watching. That night, my father called again. I let it ring. He left a message saying they were making improvements, that it was nothing to worry about, that he hoped I understood they were thinking long-term. Long-term. Another word meant to soothe. I opened my notebook and wrote the date, the time, the details. I wrote calmly the way my mother would have. They believed silence meant consent. They believed confidence would protect them. They believed the story they were telling online would become the truth. What they didn't realize was that every step they took without looking back was another piece of proof falling into place. And once that happened, there would be no way to pretend they hadn't known exactly what they were doing. By the 6th morning, my body had learned how to move without asking permission from my fear. I woke before dawn, the motel room still dark, and sat on the edge of the bed listening to the hum of the heater. There was a calm in me that hadn't existed since my mother died. Not peace. Readiness. I drove into town just after sunrise. The diner on Main Street had its lights on the same way it always had when I was a teenager heading to school. I didn't go in. I parked across the street and watched a pickup with the contractor's logo pull into the gravel lot down the block. I wrote down the time. I wrote down the plate number. At the county records office, the clerk recognized my last name and stiffened before smoothing her expression. She spoke carefully, like someone who had learned that land disputes traveled fast in a small town. I asked about permits for fencing and grading on the east pasture. She checked the system twice. Nothing. No applications, no approvals. She printed a statement on official letterhead confirming it. I thanked her and didn't linger. From there, I went to the bank my mother had listed in her notebook. The branch manager was a woman my mother's age with steel gray hair pulled into a knot. She asked me to wait, then brought me into a small office with a window that looked out over the parking lot. She spoke plainly. The accounts tied to the ranch were structured so that withdrawals over a certain amount required dual authorization. My father's name allowed him to manage day-to-day expenses, but not to drain or redirect funds connected to the land my mother owned. There had been attempts, 2 of them, both denied. Someone was testing the limits, she said. I left with statements and signatures, my folder growing thicker with each stop. Evidence stacked the way my mother had intended it to, quietly, unmistakably. That afternoon, I drove past the ranch without stopping. From the road, I could see the fence posts lined up like soldiers waiting for orders. A rented excavator sat idle near the creek. I imagined my father's voice explaining it all away, calling it progress, calling it necessary. My phone buzzed. A text from my stepsister sent from a number I barely recognized. She wrote that she didn't understand why I was making things difficult. That Dad was stressed, that Mom was crying all the time. She said I could come back if I apologized. I stared at the screen for a long moment. 15 years old, and already learning how to carry other people's guilt like it was her own. I typed and erased 3 different responses before settling on nothing. Silence was kinder than the truth she wasn't ready to hear. By evening, the lawyer called me back. He had reviewed everything: the posts, the permit confirmation, the bank statements. He said the phrase I had been waiting for: they're exposed. We talked through the next steps slowly. There would be no shouting, no dramatic return without preparation. He would file for immediate enforcement based on unauthorized alterations and attempted financial misuse. He would notify local law enforcement, not as a threat, as a procedure. They won't expect it, he said. They think this is still a family argument. That night, the ranch appeared on my phone again. A new video. My stepmother walking through the house smiling too brightly, talking about fresh starts and blended families. She stood in the doorway of my mother's old bedroom, gesturing as if she owned the air itself. I felt the old anger rise sharp and familiar. Then it passed. What replaced it was something steadier. This wasn't personal anymore. It was documented. The next morning, the contractor's truck returned to the east pasture. I arrived 10 minutes later, parking on the shoulder where I wouldn't be seen from the house. I watched as workers unloaded equipment. I recorded. I noted the lack of permits displayed anywhere on the site. An hour later, a sheriff's vehicle pulled in behind them. I didn't get out of my car. I didn't need to. From a distance, I watched the confusion ripple through the group. Papers pulled from glove compartments, phones raised, voices lifting then lowering. My father appeared from the house, his posture stiff, his hands spread in practiced disbelief. I had seen that stance my entire childhood, the one he used when he planned to talk his way out of consequences. The deputy shook his head. Work stopped. Engines cut. The excavator went silent. My phone rang. It was my father. I let it ring. He called again. I answered on the third try, my voice even. "You sent the sheriff," he said. "No," I replied. "I followed the law." He told me I was overreacting, that I didn't understand how things worked anymore, that Montana wasn't like wherever I'd been living. He said family matters should stay in the family. Family doesn't ignore wills, I said, and it doesn't change locks on someone who just got out of the hospital. He went quiet. I could hear my stepmother in the background, her voice sharp with panic. Someone else was crying. "We can talk," he said finally. "There's no need to make this bigger. It's already documented," I said. "I'll let my lawyer speak for me." I ended the call and sat there until the workers packed up and left, until the deputy drove away, until the ranch looked still again like it had before anyone tried to take it. I didn't feel victorious. I felt resolved. That afternoon, my lawyer filed the motions. By evening, notices were served. Formal language replaced family arguments. Authority replaced assumption. I drove back to the motel as the sun dipped behind the hills. My body ached, but it was a clean ache, the kind that comes from standing your ground instead of bracing for impact. They had believed speed would protect them. They had believed confidence could erase paperwork. They had believed silence meant weakness. They were wrong on every count. And for the first time since I stepped off that hospital transport van, I knew the ground under my feet was finally solid again. The papers changed everything faster than I expected. By the next morning, the ranch felt smaller, like the walls themselves had learned to listen. I didn't need to be there to feel it. Word travels in Montana the way weather does, quietly at first, then all at once. My phone started ringing before breakfast. An aunt I hadn't spoken to in years left a message saying she didn't know both sides, but family shouldn't air things out in public. A cousin texted that Dad was beside himself, that I was hurting people who loved me. No one asked what had happened to me. They asked why I was making it uncomfortable. I forwarded everything to my lawyer and kept my mouth shut. Late that morning, he called to tell me my father had hired counsel of his own. Not a local generalist. Someone from out of county. Expensive, aggressive. The kind of move people make when they believe volume can replace substance. "They're going to push for mediation," my lawyer said. "They'll frame this as misunderstanding." I could picture it perfectly. My stepmother with her careful smile. My father leaning forward, palms open, asking everyone to be reasonable. I had grown up watching them turn confusion into leverage. By noon, a letter arrived at the motel, slid under my door like a warning. It accused me of emotional distress, of harassment, of interfering with lawful improvements. It demanded I cease contact and remove myself from the area. I read it twice and laughed once, not because it was funny, because it was desperate. My lawyer wasn't amused, but he wasn't worried either. He dictated a response that stuck to facts and dates and left no room for theatrics. He reminded me again not to speak directly to anyone involved. That afternoon, I drove to the edge of the ranch again, not to watch, but to remember. The pasture was quiet. The fence posts still lay where they had been abandoned. The land didn't care about letters or threats. It had outlasted worse. As I stood there, a car pulled up behind me. My father stepped out alone. I shouldn't have been surprised. He had always believed face-to-face would bend me. He walked toward me slowly, hands in his jacket pockets, his expression set somewhere between regret and authority. "Emily," he said like my name was a question. "I'm represented." I replied, not turning around. "I know," he said, "but I'm still your father." I faced him then. He looked older than I remembered, not weaker, just worn. The confidence he wore so easily on the porch days earlier had cracked. "You could have come home," he said. "You didn't have to do it like this." "I did come home," I said. "You changed the lock." He flinched just slightly. Then he recovered. "We were protecting what we built," he said. "You left. You moved on." "I left because you asked me to," I said. "And I came back because my mother was dying." He sighed like I was being unreasonable. "Your stepmother is terrified," he said. "Your sister doesn't understand why you hate her." "I don't hate her," I said. "I hate being erased." He shook his head. "You're making enemies you don't need." "I'm enforcing a will," I said. "That's all." For a moment, something like fear crossed his face. He had expected anger, tears, bargaining. He hadn't expected calm. "You'll lose people over this," he said. "I already did," I replied. He stood there a while longer, searching for something to say that would land. When he didn't find it, he turned and walked back to his car. He didn't look back. That evening, the lawyer called again. The other side had requested an emergency mediation session. They wanted it fast, before enforcement escalated further, before authorities got involved again. "They're feeling pressure," he said. The next day, we met in a small conference room at the courthouse. Neutral ground, fluorescent lights, a long table that made everyone look smaller than they wanted to be. My father sat across from me. My stepmother beside him, her hands folded tight. Their attorney spoke first, framing the situation as a breakdown in communication during a stressful time. I let my lawyer handle it. He laid out the timeline calmly. The will, the delayed probate, the attempted withdrawals, the unpermitted construction, the lock change, each point backed by documentation, each assumption met with proof. When he finished, the room went quiet. My stepmother's smile disappeared. My father stared at the table. The mediator asked if there was anything they wanted to add. My father cleared his throat. "We thought we were doing the right thing." "That's not the standard," the mediator said gently. "The law is." By the end of the session, there was no agreement. There couldn't be. The facts didn't bend. Outside, my stepsister waited in the hallway. She looked smaller than her age, her eyes red. She started toward me, then stopped unsure. "I didn't know," she said quietly. "They said you didn't want us." I knelt in front of her so we were eye level. "I wanted honesty," I said. "And time." She nodded, tears spilling over. Someone called her name, and she turned away. I walked out of the courthouse alone. That night, the posts online disappeared one by one. Photos deleted, videos taken down. Silence replaced performance. It wasn't mercy that caused it. It was reality. They had tried pressure. They had tried guilt. They had tried authority. None of it moved the ground beneath the truth. And for the first time, I understood something my mother had always known. When people realize they're standing on land they don't own, they panic. And panic makes mistakes. I went to sleep knowing the next move would be theirs, and that whatever it was, I would be ready. The official notice arrived before sunrise, folded crisp and final, its language colder than the Montana air. I read it twice at the small motel desk, my coffee untouched, and felt the weight of it settle in my hands. Enforcement. Vacate. Immediate compliance. Words my mother had trusted more than promises. By mid-morning, my lawyer confirmed the timeline. The order had teeth. Local law enforcement would serve it and oversee removal if necessary. There would be no more warnings. No more grace periods dressed up as kindness. The land would answer to the law, not to whoever spoke the loudest. I drove toward the ranch behind the sheriff's vehicle, keeping a respectful distance. The sky was wide and pale, the kind that makes everything feel exposed. When we turned onto the gravel drive, my chest tightened, not with fear, but with recognition. This was the place where my childhood had unfolded. This was also the place where they had decided I no longer belonged. The sheriff parked first. I stayed in my car. My father opened the door before the knock came. He must have been watching from the window. His shoulders slumped when he saw the badge. My stepmother appeared behind him, her face tight, her mouth already forming explanations. The sheriff spoke calmly. He read from the paper. He did not argue. He did not explain beyond what was written. He simply stated what would happen next. My father tried to interrupt. He raised his voice just enough to signal control the way he always had. The sheriff held up a hand. "This isn't a discussion," he said. "You've been served." That was when they noticed me sitting in my car at the edge of the drive. My stepmother pointed. My father turned. Our eyes met across the distance, and something in his expression shifted. Not anger, not disbelief. Understanding. He finally saw that this wasn't a bluff or a phase. This was the consequence of choices he had made while assuming I would stay silent. They were given time to gather essentials. Not long. Just enough. I watched as boxes were carried out, suitcases zipped, a life rearranged under supervision. The ranch felt hollowed out, its sounds reduced to footsteps and murmurs. My stepsister came out last. She hesitated when she saw me, then walked over slowly. She stopped a few feet away. Her hands clenched in the sleeves of her jacket. "I'm sorry," she said. "I didn't know how bad it was." "I know I said." She looked back at the house. "Where are we supposed to go?" I chose my words carefully. "That's something your parents will have to figure out." She nodded, tears pooling, and turned away. I didn't stop her. This wasn't punishment. It was separation. When the last car pulled away, the sheriff approached me. He asked if I wanted him to walk the property with me. I said yes. We moved through the house room by room. The changed lock lay on the kitchen counter, removed and useless. My mother's bedroom stood empty, the doorway still bearing the faint marks where my stepmother's decorations had been hung and taken down again. Outside, the fence posts remained where they had been abandoned, a quiet monument to overreach. The sheriff made notes. He asked if there was anything else out of place. I pointed out the disturbed soil near the creek. He photographed it. Before he left, he told me to call if there were any issues. He said it like he meant it. When I was finally alone, the ranch breathed again. Wind moved through the grass. A door creaked somewhere deep in the house. I stood on the porch and let it all settle, the quiet loud in my ears. My phone buzzed. Messages poured in, some supportive, some accusing, some pretending neutrality while quietly taking sides. I didn't answer any of them. I forwarded what mattered to my lawyer and ignored the rest. By evening, the story had reached the local grapevine. The posts that had vanished were replaced by speculation. People talked about wills and inheritance and family drama, about karma and justice, about how things turn when you least expect them to. I didn't correct anyone. Truth doesn't need a press release. That night I slept in my childhood room for the first time since my mother's funeral. The bed felt smaller than I remembered. Or maybe I was simply different now. I dreamed of fences being pulled up and set down again, each post finding its rightful place. In the morning, I walked the land with a notebook the same way my mother used to. I wrote down what needed repair and what needed rest. I made plans that didn't involve proving anything to anyone. My father called just after noon. His voice sounded tired, stripped of performance. "We're staying with friends," he said. This didn't have to happen. "It did," I replied. "Because you made it happen." He was quiet for a long moment. "You've embarrassed us." "You embarrassed yourselves," I said gently. He sighed. "What do you want now?" "I want what's mine," I said. "And I want peace." When the call ended, I felt no triumph. Only finality. As the sun lowered over the pasture, I understood something that had taken me years to learn. Power doesn't announce itself. It documents, it waits, and it moves when the time is right. They had tried to take everything from me while I was at my weakest. They believed the hospital bed had stripped me of my footing. What they never saw was that while my body was healing, the ground beneath me had been secured. And now, standing alone on land that finally answered only to me, I knew the hardest part wasn't taking it back. It was choosing what to do with it next. The quiet after they left was not peaceful at first. It was heavy, like the pause after an argument when everyone is waiting for the next blow. I woke before dawn again, listening for engines on the drive that never came, for raised voices that stayed locked in memory instead of air. I spent the morning changing the locks myself, not because I had to, but because I wanted my hands on the work. Each turn of the screwdriver felt deliberate grounding. When I finished, I stood back and looked at the door. The click of the new lock was clean, final. This one was mine. By noon, the calls started again. A number I didn't recognize flashed on my screen. I answered out of habit. It was my father's attorney. He spoke smoothly, professionally, as if the past week had been nothing more than a scheduling conflict. He said they were considering their options. He said court was expensive and emotionally draining. He said families often regretted letting things go too far. I listened without interrupting. He suggested a settlement. Not an apology, not acknowledgement. A settlement. He said my father was willing to be generous if it meant regaining access to the property. Shared use. Seasonal arrangements. Language designed to blur lines again. "No," I said when he finished. There was a pause. He hadn't expected that word so quickly. "You should consider—" "No," I repeated. "All communication goes through my lawyer." I ended the call and sat at the kitchen table for a long time, staring at the grain in the wood. This was the phase my mother had warned me about in her notebook, the part where pressure returns wearing a calmer face. That afternoon, a certified letter arrived. This one wasn't bluster. It was a formal notice of intent to contest the will. I read it slowly, my pulse steady. I had known this was coming. People who lose power rarely accept it quietly. They look for another door, even if it leads nowhere. My lawyer called an hour later. He sounded calm, almost bored. "They don't have standing," he said. "But they're hoping to delay. Wear you down." I asked him what it would take. "Time," he said. "And patience. Patience." Another word my mother had written more than once. That evening I drove into town for groceries. Halfway down the cereal aisle, I ran into someone I hadn't expected. My stepmother's sister. She looked startled to see me, then composed herself quickly. "I'm sorry about all this," she said. "You know your father's been under a lot of stress." I nodded politely. "She just wants to talk," she continued. "Maybe clear the air." I knew what this was. A soft entry point. A chance to reframe. "I'm not available," I said. Her smile tightened. "You don't have to be so cold." "I'm not cold," I replied. "I'm careful." She left without another word. Back at the ranch, I found the mailbox stuffed with envelopes. Most were junk. One wasn't. It was handwritten, the letters uneven, the return address unfamiliar. Inside was a note from my stepsister. She wrote about sleeping on a couch, about missing her room, about not knowing which version of the story was true. She said she didn't blame me, but she didn't know where she fit anymore. I read it twice, then folded it carefully and set it aside. She was caught in the undertow of choices she hadn't made. That mattered to me. It didn't change anything, but it mattered. The next morning I met my lawyer at the courthouse. Not for a hearing, for preparation. He walked me through the likely arguments, the weak points they would try to exploit. He showed me how thin their case was, how much of it relied on emotion instead of fact. "They'll say you abandoned the property," he said. "I didn't," I replied. "I was taking care of my mother." He nodded. "Exactly. They'll say you acted out of spite. I acted out of compliance." He smiled at that. Judges appreciate clarity. As we left, we passed my father and his attorney in the hallway. My father stopped short when he saw me. He looked smaller here, stripped of the ranch and the performance it allowed him. "This is going too far," he said quietly. "You went too far," I replied. I followed. He shook his head. "You're tearing the family apart." "There was nothing left to tear," I said. His attorney touched his arm, guiding him away. Outside, the wind had picked up, carrying the smell of rain. I sat in my car for a moment, hands on the wheel, letting the tension drain. This wasn't a dramatic turning point. It was a grind. And I was built for it now. Back at the ranch, I walked the perimeter at sunset. I stopped at the east pasture where the fence posts still lay. I imagined them installed properly one day with permits and purpose, not as a symbol of control, but of care. As darkness fell, my phone buzzed again, a voicemail from my father. He sounded different this time. Tired, almost pleading. "You've made your point," he said. "Let's end this." I deleted the message without responding. Ending things was exactly what I was doing, just not the way he wanted. That night, I pulled out my mother's notebook again. Near the back, beneath a list of legal contacts and account numbers, she had written a single line in the margin. "Do not confuse endurance with forgiveness." I closed the book and turned off the light. They were preparing for a fight they couldn't win. They thought delay might save them. That exhaustion would soften me. What they didn't understand was that I had already survived the worst part. I had been sick. I had been locked out. I had been dismissed and underestimated. Everything after that was just paperwork, and I was ready to see it through. The hearing was set for a Tuesday morning early enough that the courthouse halls still smelled faintly of cleaning solution and old paper. I arrived before my lawyer sat on a wooden bench and watched people pass with folders tucked under their arms, each of us carrying a different version of urgency. When my father walked in, he didn't look at me. He kept his eyes fixed ahead, jaw tight, shoulders squared like this was another negotiation he could muscle through. My stepmother followed her face, composed, her hands clasped around a leather bag that looked too new for comfort. My stepsister wasn't there. I was relieved by that. My lawyer joined me and spoke quietly, reminding me to answer only what was asked to let the documents speak. I nodded. I had learned the value of letting paper carry weight. Inside the courtroom, the judge took the bench without ceremony. No speeches, no dramatic pauses, just procedure, the kind that favors preparation over performance. The opposing attorney began by framing the story the way I expected. A grieving family, a misunderstanding, a daughter who had been absent and returned with demands. He used words like confusion and intent and fairness, hoping they would blur dates and signatures. When it was our turn, my lawyer stood and laid everything out in order. The will, the delayed probate, the boundaries of authority, the attempted withdrawals, the unpermitted construction, the lock change, each point anchored to a date, a document, a confirmation. The judge asked questions, specific ones, about timing, about notice, about permits. My father's attorney answered where he could and deflected where he couldn't. The judge's expression didn't change. Then I was called to speak. I stood my hands steady at my sides and answered what was asked. Where I had been living, why I returned, when I became ill, how long I was hospitalized. I described coming home and finding the lock changed my voice, even my words plain. Why didn't you confront them immediately, the judge asked. Because I wanted to understand my legal position before I spoke, I said. He nodded once. My father was called next. He spoke about protecting the ranch, about making decisions for the good of the family. He avoided specifics. When asked about permits, he said he believed they weren't necessary. When asked about the bank attempts, he said he didn't recall. The judge leaned forward slightly. Belief is not authorization, he said. Silence settled over the room. After a brief recess, the judge returned with a decision that was clear and unadorned. The will stood. The enforcement actions were valid. The contest was denied. Any further interference would carry consequences. It was over. Not with a bang, with a sentence. Outside the courtroom, my father stopped me in the hallway. His face was pale, his eyes rimmed red. He looked older than he had ever looked to me. You didn't have to humiliate us, he said. I didn't, I replied. I protected myself. My stepmother stepped forward, her composure finally cracking. We took care of that place, she said. We loved it. Love doesn't override ownership, I said. And it doesn't excuse deception. My lawyer gently guided me away. By the time I stepped outside, the sun had broken through the clouds. I stood on the courthouse steps for a moment, breathing in the cool air, letting the weight lift. Not all of it. Just enough. The drive back to the ranch felt different. The road stretched ahead familiar and steady. When I arrived, I parked and sat in the car, listening to the wind move through the grass. I thought about my mother, about how carefully she had planned this moment without ever seeing it. I walked the house slowly, room by room, not to inspect, but to reclaim. I opened windows. I wiped down surfaces. I placed my mother's notebook on the kitchen counter where it belonged. My phone buzzed. A message from my stepsister. She said the hearing was over. She said she was scared. She asked if we could talk sometime. I typed a response and paused. Then I sent it. I told her I was willing when things were calm and when it didn't involve choosing sides. That evening, a truck pulled into the drive. A neighbor dropped off a pie without saying much. She hugged me quick and firm and told me my mother would be proud. I believed her. As night settled, I sat on the porch and watched the sky darken over the pasture. The fence posts were still there waiting. I imagined the day they would be set properly with care and consent, not urgency and entitlement. I thought about everything that had been said about me in the past weeks, that I was vindictive, that I was cold, that I was tearing the family apart. None of it fit anymore. I hadn't taken everything back. I had taken what was already mine and refused to apologize for it. The house creaked softly as it cooled, familiar and alive. I felt tired in a way that promised sleep, not collapse. Tomorrow would bring cleanup, repairs, conversations, consequences. But tonight, I allowed myself one simple truth. The law had done what it was meant to do. And so had I. The days after the hearing didn't slow down the way I expected. They stretched out instead, wide and demanding, filled with decisions that had nothing to do with courtrooms and everything to do with responsibility. Winning didn't bring rest. It brought stewardship. I started each morning early, walking the land while the air was still cool. I checked the creek where the soil had been disturbed, noted where erosion might become a problem if it wasn't addressed before winter. I called a licensed surveyor recommended by the county, scheduled a full assessment, and filed the permits my father had ignored. Everything moved slower when done correctly. That was the point. Inside the house, I sorted through what had been moved and what had been taken. Most of it was small. Decor choices that never belonged to the walls. Furniture shifted to suit someone else's taste. I didn't feel anger putting things back. I felt clarity. The house wasn't rejecting anyone. It was returning to itself. Neighbors stopped by in pairs or alone, some curious, some supportive, some careful not to say too much. They asked how I was holding up. They spoke about my mother in past tense, sharing memories I hadn't known. Each conversation stitched me back into a place I had never truly left. One afternoon, a letter arrived from my father. Handwritten. No lawyer letterhead. No threats tucked into formal language. Just ink on paper. He wrote that he didn't recognize himself anymore. That he had convinced himself he was protecting something when he was really protecting his pride. He said he missed my mother. He said he missed me. He didn't apologize. Not fully. But he didn't accuse either. I read it twice, then folded it and placed it in the drawer beside my mother's notebook. It wasn't closure. It was a beginning of something quieter. Or maybe just an ending without fireworks. Either way, it was enough for now. A few days later, my stepsister came by with a friend. She stood at the edge of the drive, unsure whether to approach. I walked out to meet her. She looked relieved, like she had been holding her breath for weeks. She didn't ask to come inside. She didn't ask for anything. She just wanted to see the place one more time. We walked the pasture together, talking about school and small things. She asked about my mother. I told her a story about the way she used to hum while cooking off-key and unapologetic. Before she left, she hugged me hard. "I don't know where I fit yet," she said. "That's okay," I replied. "You don't have to know right now." When she drove away, I stood watching until the dust settled. I didn't feel responsible for fixing her situation. I felt responsible for not repeating it. That night, I sat on the porch with a glass of iced tea and listened to the land settle. Crickets started up near the fence line. The sky opened wide stars, sharp and unapologetic. I thought about how close I had come to losing all of this without ever fighting back. How easy it would have been to believe I didn't deserve it. I thought about the hospital room, the beeping machines, the way weakness makes people underestimate you. I understood now that my silence back then wasn't passivity. It was preparation. In the following days, I met with a ranch manager about leasing a portion of the grazing land to a neighboring operation. Not selling, leasing, keeping ownership while ensuring the land stayed productive. It felt like the kind of decision my mother would have approved of. Practical, sustainable, forward-looking. I updated the accounts, tightened oversight, made sure no one could move money without proper authorization again. Each signature felt like an affirmation rather than a defense. I wasn't guarding against theft anymore. I was building stability. One evening, as I filed paperwork at the kitchen table, I found myself smiling without realizing it. Not because everything was perfect, but because it was mine to manage mistakes and all. The phone rang just after dinner. My father again. I hesitated, then answered. "I won't come by," he said quickly. "I just wanted you to know I'm trying to figure out what comes next." "So am I," said. There was a long pause. "I don't expect forgiveness," he added. "I'm not offering it," I said gently. "I'm offering distance." He accepted that without argument. When the call ended, I felt lighter, not reconciled, unburdened. As the week drew to a close, I realized something else. The urge to explain myself had faded. I no longer needed everyone to understand why I had done what I did. The law had already spoken. The land had already settled. What mattered now was how I lived with what I had reclaimed. I took my mother's notebook out one last time and read the final page. It wasn't about assets or precautions. It was a single sentence written smaller than the rest. Take care of what takes care of you. I closed the book and placed it back in the drawer. Outside, the wind moved through the grass, steady and familiar. The ranch didn't ask me to prove anything. It didn't ask me to defend my place in it. It simply waited the way it always had for someone willing to listen. And for the first time since I returned from the hospital, I wasn't bracing for what might be taken next. I was choosing what to protect. The evening I finally slept with the windows open, the house sounded like it remembered me. The floors creaked in familiar places. The wind moved through the curtains the way it had when I was a child, carrying the smell of grass and distant rain. Nothing felt urgent anymore. Nothing felt like it was about to be taken. I stood on the front porch as the sun lowered behind the pasture, the sky softening into shades of gold and gray. This was the hour my mother used to love most. She called it the honest part of the day when the land stopped pretending to be productive and simply existed. I leaned against the railing and let myself be still. People think revenge has to be loud, that it needs raised voices, slammed doors, public humiliation. What I learned is that the strongest kind doesn't look like revenge at all. It looks like order. It looks like restraint. It looks like letting the law do what emotions never can. My father hadn't called again. My stepmother hadn't posted anything new. The silence that once felt threatening now felt earned. Not because they were afraid of me, but because there was nothing left for them to argue with. The story they tried to tell had ended where the paperwork began. Inside the house was clean, but not staged. My mother's things were where they belonged. My things had found their place again. I didn't rush to fill the empty spaces. Some rooms need to breathe before they know what they're meant for. I thought about the version of myself who had come home from the hospital weak, in ways no one could see, standing on the porch with a bag in my hand and nowhere to go. I remembered the way my father's voice sounded when he told me I wasn't part of the family anymore. How easily those words could have hollowed me out if I had let them. What saved me wasn't anger. It wasn't confrontation. It was silence used deliberately. Silence that gathered evidence instead of excuses. Silence that waited for the right moment instead of demanding instant relief. The land didn't change during all of this. It didn't take sides. It simply responded to whoever treated it with care. That was the lesson my mother had been trying to leave me buried between account numbers and legal notes. Ownership isn't just about holding something. It's about showing up for it when it's inconvenient. Later that night, I locked the front door from the inside and paused with my hand on the knob. The sound was different this time. Solid. Certain. I didn't double-check the windows. I didn't scan the driveway. I trusted the quiet. I poured myself a glass of water and sat at the kitchen table looking out at the darkened pasture. Tomorrow there would be work. Calls to return. Decisions to make about the future of the ranch. None of it felt heavy anymore. It felt chosen. I understood then that justice doesn't always feel like triumph. Sometimes it feels like relief. Sometimes it feels like finally standing on ground that doesn't shift beneath your feet. If you've ever been excluded, pushed aside, or told you didn't belong where you knew you did, I hope this story reminded you of something important. You don't have to shout to be heard. You don't have to explain yourself to people who benefit from misunderstanding you. And you don't have to act before you're ready. Sometimes the most powerful move is to wait. Prepare and let the truth arrive on its own terms. If this story resonated with you, if you've lived through your own version of family betrayal, inheritance conflict, or quiet payback, I'd love to hear your thoughts. Share your experience in the comments. You never know who might need to read it. And if you want to hear more stories like this, stories about justice, karma, and reclaiming dignity when everything seems stacked against you, stay with the channel. Subscribe so you don't miss what comes next. Some stories don't end with applause. They end with peace, and sometimes that's the real victory.